Excellent. Okay, I think we'll start then. Welcome to the Working with the Directories session. It's a session that's very interactive. So I've got a panel here with the editors of the 3 major directories in the UK, and it's designed so you can ask them lots of questions. You've used the Slido thing, I think, already this morning. You can do that. You go to slido.com, you put in your LFMS 18, it should be up on all the slides, and you can ask us questions there. If you don't like doing that, you can raise your hands, and I'm sure we can get a microphone around to you as well. But what we wanted to do with this session is to give you the opportunity to pick the editor's brains, to look at what really matters to them when they're doing their research, so that you can tailor your efforts. You can make best use of your resources when you're submitting to them. What we're seeing is the directories still being every bit as relevant now as they ever have been. We were talking earlier about seeing when RFPs come in, seeing spaces for your directory rankings in those, especially in things connected with PPP or government work. So we're not seeing any slowdown of that. So we'll crack on, I think. So let me introduce my panel. On my far right there I have Sam Duke, and Sam is the head of research at Legal Media Group's research. He's one of the titles in there is the IFLR 1000, so that's a name I'm sure you're familiar with. Helen Marshall is the editor of Legal 500 EMEA, and Rick Jakubowski we have here, who is Chambers Global Editor. So I think we'll start with you, Rick. What are the updates then? What's been happening post-acquisition at Chambers?
Sure. So as David just mentioned there's a lot of change going on at Chambers at the moment. As many of you may know, we were the subject of a buyout earlier this year. So a private equity firm called Inflection came in and made an offer for the business, which our long-serving leader of the past, Michael Chambers, accepted. And I think that has brought around a series of what I feel are really, really excellent changes. I think we're getting fresh investment, fresh ideas into the business, and I think there's probably a few key things I'd particularly point to in terms of where Chambers is heading next and how it affects sort of how we deal with all of you. I mean, the first one is it's interesting that sort of this session is titled sort of Working with Directories, and I think Chambers has always, it's built a very strong brand on the basis of being a directory. But we very much feel that we need to take a next step sort of to build on that, and I think certainly our new leadership very much see Chambers as probably more of a business analytics firm as well. I think we want to very much use the research that we do and sort of the numbers that we have in the business, our research team of 200 plus strong, to gather the information that you need in order to analyse where your firms are going, what new opportunities there are for you, and what clients' reactions are in terms of the way that you're perceived and the way that you go out to market. So that's one sort of major change that I think is underway already. From a personal point of view, sort of global editor, the other sort of change that I know we're focusing on at the moment is the way that increasingly the legal industry is so internationalized in order to match the way that client businesses have been globalizing themselves. They want firms that are able to match their needs, and that increasingly means looking beyond your own borders. I think Chambers has always had some emphasis on that, but it's certainly something that I'm in control of trying to sort of upscale, and we're looking at not just in terms of how firms expand in terms of their presence, but the different ways in which firms can go out to market and become an international law firm instead of just focusing on domestic issues. And I think that can be opening offices, new places. It can mean simply sort of working through relationships or expanding your knowledge of how business operates culturally in different areas. But that's also, a big new thing within Chambers that we're developing. And probably the third angle of this is that it's not just about what we think. I think in terms of how chambers go forward, we're very much interested in what you have to say, what you want more from us. And I think we've sort of put together a poll today that I think will be coming up on the Slido thing shortly. And we really want to give you all the opportunity to maybe tell us what you'd like to see more of. What would you be interested in sort of having greater involvement in with Chambers content? So there's a few sort of different multiple choice options there. And I think if there's something that you think is important for you, then it would be great to hear from you on that.
Great. We'll leave that poll running for a little while, so you can go on to slido.com. Ella, what's new at Legal 500?
Yeah, so we've obviously made quite a few changes this year with regard to the submission process, which many of you will have gone through for EMEA. You may have seen an email last week that went out from our publishing director, just to really reverse that. From now on, we're asking firms to go back to the old system of submitting via email for the submissions and referee spreadsheets. I think that's going to be quite welcome, really. So that's how it is going forwards there. The other change is, of course, that we've got a new UK editor who started with us in September. So we expect a number of new practice areas for the UK to be introduced when the guidelines go up. And obviously the guide just launched last week. And in addition to that, we were also rolling out a new magazine, 500, which will be available to people who have a profile with Legal 500.
Thank you. Sam?
I guess probably from our side, the main thing would be we went through a restructuring last year. So for anyone who's not familiar with the Legal Media Group name, we're basically the legal publishing business of Euromoney. And we used to operate within a group within Euromoney, and internally we used the designation Legal Media Group. We didn't really use it externally that much. We've now brought all our titles more closely together into three brackets. So we've got research, insight, and events. Events is self-explanatory, but insight is our magazine business. So IFLR, you might know the brand, managing intellectual property, international tax review. And then the research side is the associated directories. So that's IFLR 1000, MIP's IP Stars, World Tax and World TP from International Tax Review, and benchmark litigation. Benchmark, if anyone's here from the US, you probably will know that name. Europe and Asia slightly less because we've only just launched there this year. But yeah, that's the main thing. So we went through the restructuring to try to bring all our research processes and procedures and things like that into line and make it easier for firms to submit to the different directories that we have. And the other thing is, I guess kind of in line with what's been said already, there's obviously been a shift, and I imagine we're going to talk about this, with sort of directories moving more towards using data better. We've been working the last few years on developing essentially what's starting off as like a deals database, which will be a standalone product where you can search for individual legal matters, find out who worked on them, with the idea being that if you're looking for very specific legal advice that goes a bit beyond the rankings, then you can find that. So if you're looking for someone to work on the underwriter side of a covered bond or something, you can go in and find similar examples and see who worked on it. So that's a big project which is coming. We've been working on it in sort of beta mode for a couple of years, but it should be quite exciting.
Good. We see on your slides your poll here, Rick, about more client feedback and on the firm and the individual. That seems to be very popular. Yep. One thing here, broader range of industry expertise. Are any of you looking at covering different areas by sector, or looking at where AI or automation comes in, where a firm's expertise play out in that direction? Is that something you're looking at?
Yes, to both, actually. So I think Chambers and I think some of the other directories as well, we do all have some coverage of sector expertise already. I think one thing we're sort of looking into is actually how you cover that as well, because I think in most instances sort of sector expertise and sort of practice area expertise, they tend to overlap and interrelate a great deal. I think one thing we're looking into is sort of broadening out how we cover that overlap, making sure that it's maybe easier for a client to find someone with a specific type of expertise within a sector or vice versa. So if you're an energy provider and you want someone who knows the way that your industry works, which is increasingly something that clients definitely want, then we should also be able to help them find, well, I want the M&A energy guy or the regulatory energy guy and things like that. So that's something we're conscious of. In terms of tech, I think that's something that is maybe something slightly newer in the legal industry, but it's definitely something I think clients are interested in and concerned with. And I think we are seeing in sort of the feedback that we get through, whereas it wouldn't have been a feature maybe 10 years ago. Nowadays, clients will maybe make distinctions between sort of how well law firms have sort of leveraged technology, how they've used that to maybe make the sort of the process of working together slightly easier. So we're talking, even sort of kind of online kind of login areas where they can access documents, they can see the updates, so they don't necessarily have to wait for their relationship partner to get it back into the office to find out maybe what's going on. Things like that do definitely make a difference, and I think increasingly that will be maybe something that even, as Sam mentioned, when we're bringing in sort of data, we can look at how clients maybe score firms in terms of how well set up they are to sort of give clients sort of modern technology options in the way that they work with them.
Good. So watch this space at Chambers then.
Definitely.
Are there any movements in those directions?
Well, similar to what Rick said, we do have a number of industry focus areas in certain jurisdictions already, have like a sector-specific approach, and with AI, something we're considering, but we haven't made any firm commitments to as yet.
On our side, well, we have industry rankings we launched them this year for one of our Asia titles called Asia Law, which it was interesting to see how it went actually, because when we first announced we were doing industry rankings, a lot of the firms there wasn't kickback so much, but there was a bit of confusion about what those rankings would be, because I think it's not that it's new to the legal industry, but I think a lot of lawyers and BD still tend to think in terms of practice areas, in terms of guides at least. So we had to sort of explain what would actually go into an energy ranking, i.e., is it just energy projects work? Is it sort of any work from any practice area that's related to energy? So there was a bit of confusion, but when we clarified everything, when we released the guidelines, during the process, people seemed to quite like it. So we're hoping to build off that more with some of our other guides. We already had a lot of our lawyer records tagged with industry sector, because we thought that was just a useful filter to have in there anyway. And in terms of the data product, that's got the industry data built in. So again, if you're looking for a specific type of work in a specific type of industry, you just filter down to it and find it that way. And then just finally, I guess on the tech side, we've looked at it in various ways. We get it in all of our client feedback surveys. We have various ratings around use of technology and innovation, which we're hoping to do more sort of specific client reports where we can put some of that data out there. We have looked at doing more rankings focused around that, but they would probably be on elements of work themselves, and more like sort of fintech rankings rather than, say, a law firm's use of technology, because a law firm can use technology in lots of different ways, so ranking them might be a bit broad, but it's something we're aware of, for sure.
Right. Well, let's look a bit more closely now then at rankings and the submission process and how we interact with you. I think there is a common approach to research at the directories, and this graphic shows you this primary research, peer interviews, firm interviews, and submissions. I've got a poll, if we can put the poll up now then, just to see where we are with who's currently submitting. Have we got the sliding thing? Here we go. So if you could look at these. So the question is, do you currently send submissions to the directories? Is it just yes or no? And we'll have a look at that. So what I want to come on to with you is what really is important to you when you're making your ranking decisions. Which of these pillars of research do you put more weight on? Is it all even, or is it some things more important? Again, Rick, let's start with you.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely right in terms of I tend to think of our research as having sort of three key pillars. And those would obviously be the client feedback, the submissions that you send us, and then sort of market feedback and firm interviews. There are always obviously other areas we can pull in from when we need to, in terms of just sort of further background research, trying to understand maybe the context of what goes on in a particular practice area. But those are the three main ones that would maybe inform decisions. And I think Chambers, it's always been that the kind of the client view is paramount. Because essentially what we think Chambers should be is to reflect sort of what drives client choices, and so we want to hear directly from them about who they choose and why, and that will always be sort of the most influential factor. Submissions sort of, I would say, are a heavy component of it as well, particularly because I think the client feedback and the submissions work in tandem. I think really the submissions are the context to what we ask the clients about. And that's why I always recommend law firms sort of make those work together as much as possible. So where you have clients that can relate to the sort of the work highlights and the information that you're putting forward, then all the better, because that can inform our questioning. I know there's always sort of a lot of concern about sort of what goes on in the market interviews. I can say at Chambers those are not nearly as influential. I think they are extremely useful, and obviously we always very much enjoy sort of engaging with the market and gathering their views. I think actually the most useful thing that comes out of those for Chambers is just really the way that the lawyers perceive what they do, the practice area, what's important maybe in terms of the skills you need, in terms of the type of work that they feel, you know, a top team would be doing in a certain area. Clearly we do get feedback on competitors. I'd say that's more influential when it's positive than negative, because I think clearly there is an element of, you know, the bias there, you know, when you're asked to sort of comment on your competitors and then sort of a negative perception comes out. But I think, you know, it's very much treated with caution. And I think where client feedback and submission information contradicts what we hear from the market, that would always be given precedence. So that's the way I would sort of table that up.
Thank you. Ella?
And we have a slightly different approach, really, because for us the submission is paramount. We want to recognise the work that the team's done over the last year, which obviously comes through in the evidence that you're putting into the submission. We actually break it down into primary and secondary factors. The primary factors would be the track record of the firm in a practice area and the submission itself, detailing the work that you've handled over the last 12 months. And then the secondary factors we would consider would, of course, be the referee feedback, the calibre of clients that you're acting for, any sector specialisms that the team may have, and the ability of other departments perhaps to feed into that work as well. We don't, after saying that though, we don't cap the number of referees that firms can provide, so you can put forward as many as you like. So yeah, please do so. And with regards to peer interviews, similar to what Rick said, we don't really feel that it's always objective. So unless it's factually verifiable, we wouldn't really consider it.
So you're slightly different, aren't you? You have a slightly different approach.
Well, it's not that much different. I mean, it's probably the main thing was we'd probably put work evidence number one, and we had the same. Yeah, as you can see on the slide, that we have the same approach in terms of sort of work evidence, firm interviews, and client interviews. We put work evidence number one, and we can mainly get away with that because we're focused on quite specific areas. So unlike these guys who have to cover every single area of law, most of the stuff that we do is quite transactional in nature. So fundamentally, if you're going to be, for example, a tier 1 M&A firm, there has to be a certain level of, you have to be able to act on like a large-scale cross-border M&A deal. So the client feedback is very important in terms of like determining the differences between, say, a group of firms who might be in tiers 1 and 2, but to get into tier 1, it can't just be good client feedback, because you might have a small M&A boutique who gets stellar client feedback, but they're not able to act on like a huge bank merger, for example. So work evidence is our primary thing, backed up by client feedback, and then peer interviews. Yeah, I mean, I'd probably just echo what these guys have said. It's certainly very useful because a lot of times the information you can get from those interviews is just stuff that you wouldn't pick up by not being in the market day to day. So if a new firm has entered into the market or there's been like a spin out or something like that, we might know about it, but we don't necessarily know whether they've been picking up deals or not if they haven't submitted or whatever. And firms are actually a very useful information source in that regard to actually say, well, actually, this new firm's come along, we have seen them on a few deals and whatever, and it just sort of feeds into the rankings a bit more. We don't put a huge level of focus on the sort of feedback that peers given in regard to their competitors unless there's very clear reasoning behind it. So if they can point, if they're saying like a firm should move up or down, and they can point to very clear reasons behind that, then that's useful to know. But if it's more vague and it's just, oh, we haven't really seen them that much in the market or whatever, then we'd normally go with the work evidence that we have, whether that be from submissions, press releases or whatever, and focus more on that. So it's not too far away, but maybe slightly more on the work side.
Yeah. In terms of the client references then, how does that work? Are there bonus points for putting down MDs, CEOs, GCs, or is that not the case? Does who is providing the feedback matter more than the feedback itself?
Well, I would say in an ideal world, of course, that would be perfect. But you really have to be realistic and ask yourself how many GCs or CEOs are actually going to respond. I mean, just to give you an instance of what's happened with the latest round of EMEA research, one individual has been put down 77 times. Yeah, it's very unlikely that that person is going to take the time to respond. So my feeling would be is that if it's somebody in the in-house team that you've worked with over the last 12 to 18 months, that's absolutely sufficient.
Yeah, I would add to that actually that frequently the CEO or GC doesn't always have actually the most engagement with the lawyers day to day. So they sometimes actually have less visibility on what was done, how well it was done, in order to give actually a really informed interview about the law firm. And I think when I say sort of client feedback is sort of paramount to us, I think that's because you can get the full picture from the client. You get sort of the size of the work, the complexity of the work, sort of how important it was to their business, how sort of large an undertaking it was. So really the person you want to speak to is actually the person who is probably the most integrally involved in the day-to-day communication with the firm. And I was a lawyer myself, so I know actually frequently that's not the CEO. That's actually someone possibly sort of more junior or probably mid-level within client organisations. And, they're very able to tell us how significant it was for the client business. So it's not really important that you maybe get sort of the famous name on the phone. It's more actually the person who can really give you the full story. From my perspective.
And being approached 77 times, that's quite a lot.
Yes. Yes.
Do you have the three of you, do you have any rules of contacting the same client so many times, or on behalf of the same firm again within a certain time period?
We don't.
You don't?
No.
So at Chambers we do, because I think particularly because we're trying to get on the phone and speak people one-to-one, we have to be realistic, and I think referee fatigue is something that not just we're concerned about, it's obviously a concern for the firms because you're giving us access to your valued clients, and we take that very seriously. So we do have certain rules around contacts, and that's also the reason that we actually cap referees, because I think once you've spoken to a certain number of people, there's probably a limit to what you learn from then speaking to another 100 people. That's just what we've found. So actually sort of coming across someone who's been referred 77 times is a bit rarer, but we certainly do get people who are put forward by a lot of firms. What we typically do to make sure that we capture all the information that they can give us is every interview that we do, we will try and, we will ensure that we give them the opportunity to actually talk about everybody who's referred them on one call. And even beyond that, our line of questioning is really trying to find out about everyone they know, everybody they work with, in a recent period, regardless of whether a law firm has referred them or not, which actually is, to us, very important, because then that brings in that sort of comparative feedback and in sometimes sort of constructive feedback, which I think is extremely useful for us and obviously can be extremely useful for firms to get back from us as well. So yeah, the typical rule is sort of 6 months. If they've been interviewed, we won't we won't interview them again 6 months later if they're put forward again. The reason for that period is just because the different guides within chambers, they run on different rotas. So in a 6 month period, usually the guides that are going to have significant degree of overlap, they'll all be happening at the same time. Research in the different countries where people will frequently work together is all going on at the same time. So it gives you more opportunity to do a wide-ranging interview that will hopefully pick up, all the information that the client can give us. So yeah, that's sort of how it works within chambers.
Right. And we've got the slidey thing, or if any of you have any questions that you want to ask, raise your hands and shout them out. Yeah, this one here.
Hi, I'm Jaya. I'm from Data and Associates India. And we obviously do other submissions. This is a question and a feedback both for the panel. We never understand if our clients have responded to you or not. And obviously I'm sure there is some protocol among all of you and your journals that you can't share the names who have not responded. But it's a bit difficult because maybe the next year we have worked with the same client and we give the same name. And maybe he's just not somebody who would want to respond. We don't have any control once we give out the client reference. Is there some way that you can tell us if there is no confidentiality issue from your end?
So yeah, as you rightly said, sort of giving precise feedback on who responds and who doesn't is a difficult thing, because clearly for chambers, and I'm sure for all the others, sort of that it's important that the clients feel they can give their feedback in confidence, and as soon as we start releasing who's responded and who hasn't, then it sort of gives away who's made comments, and particularly when firms are sort of buying things like unpublished reports and they get sort of negative feedback in there sometimes. Fingers crossed not for any of you guys, but yeah, when that happens, obviously the clients wouldn't want their identity to be revealed in terms of if they've sort of given a quote that they were unhappy about something quite often. But I mean, what we can do, I think, obviously communication is important, and certainly we want all of you to feel that you do have people you can contact within chambers. So that would typically be the editors or the deputy editors who sort of who you hopefully get to know, who sort of run the research in your countries. There's nothing wrong with sort of checking in, and what we can tell you is if there's been a significant problem with getting through to referees and we're feeling like you're putting forward people and we're having real difficulty getting responses at all, we can obviously share that information with you, and then you can take that back and say, well, maybe we need to sort of freshen up who we're putting forward or think about different people. I mean, the other thing that you guys can obviously do is sort of make sure you're getting permission from referees and letting them know, which I'm sure you all do. We do still encounter sometimes that people are putting forward people blind, which I have to say doesn't often work terribly well.
Also, does it help if we send you client feedback that they send the lawyers and if the deal gets over or it gets closed? So if they send an email to all of us saying it was a big deal and thank you for all your work. So does it help if we send that to you as well in a document along with the submission?
In terms of sort of getting regular updates on what's going on?
No, on the testimonials that they send to
Yeah.
the firm.
Oh, I see.
And the client.
So I think,
Because
Yeah.
I'm from India, in India the marketing is very tough for lawyers. They're not allowed
Yeah.
to market. So these are the only things we can
Yeah,
really
yeah,
help
yeah.
ourselves to get up the ranks. So that's why it's the concern actually from
Yeah.
the Indian market. So does it help if we send you the client feedback that we receive from the clients?
I think that obviously that's difficult for us, because I think feedback given directly to the firm from the client, it sort of lacks the independence that we're trying to offer. What we're trying to offer clients is a sort of an independent source that reflects the opinions of and the perceptions of people who are in the same position as them. And I think once that isn't independent, it's then difficult for us to rely on. So I'd say clearly there's no harm in sort of sharing things clients have said about your firm and using that in sort of the marketing material you put forward in your submission, saying, this is what we think drives clients to choose us, or this is why that they like working with us. But in terms of us placing emphasis on that in the rankings, I think we would be unable to do that. Yeah.
Yes.
A few points. My name is Evelina Georgiadis from Cyprus, Christos Tomidis. We work with all of you. researchers. I think I'm probably speaking for a lot of people here. So, you know, if someone comes in, they learn a bit about a firm, and the next year is someone else. That's one point. Another point is, obviously, there's been discussion about, you know, the feedback that firms provide on other firms. And I think a lot of the time that we're speaking to your researchers on the interviews is spent exactly on this. And obviously, we've all highlighted that this is not a terribly important part. So I think this is something that also needs to be taken into consideration. And for you, Rick Chambers, we've been number one and we're very happy in all our areas. And last year we were downgraded in one of them. And we did contact you for feedback. And one researcher did get back to us, but we didn't really receive an answer. So I'd really like to know, you know, what is, you know, the distinguishing factor in putting a firm down. So, thanks very much.
So, were those all for me, or were they more general? I don't want to sort of railroad, but okay. Well, so maybe to address the last one first. I mean, I think obviously in specific instances like that, it's important that, you know, I would go away and sort of look into what's happened. So actually, if you want to follow up on that after, I'd be more than happy to do that. I'm not sort of personally overseeing Cyprus, but certainly I'm more than happy to look into it and make sure that sort of I get some feedback from the people who are sort of more integrally involved there. You know, obviously there are only ever sort of very supported reasons for moving firms down. We don't do that lightly, particularly, you know, if from the top band from a firm that's been there a long time. I think we clearly take that decision very, very seriously. But as I say, I'm more than happy to follow up on that with you directly afterwards. So maybe after the session, I'll just give you a card and we can sort of get a call arranged or something. I mean, on the other 2 points, I mean, I know the turnover, I mean, I have to agree. I've been at Chambers sort of a long time, and I think Mark, who's actually in the audience today, who's come over and taken over at Chambers, it's one of the things that he's worked really, really hard to address coming in. I think we have actually halved, or maybe more than halved, our turnover since that happened. And I think that's been a recognition of, you know, the investment and the new culture that's come in. But I think that is something that we're working very hard to improve. I think the other point on that is that while, yes, there is some sort of change at the sort of the base level of our research, you know, the people who are really driving the decisions and overseeing the work and making sure that, you know, we get to know the market as well as possible are actually at a more senior level, and they tend to actually specialise in certain regions or certain practice areas depending on the sort of the jurisdiction we're talking about for quite some time. So there is continuity there to sort of make sure that any turnover we have doesn't lead to mistakes. But I still agree, we want less turnover and we want people to sort of stay with us over the long term. I mean, obviously I touched on the sort of the peer feedback earlier. And yes, that's absolutely true. We do spend a lot of time talking about the market and the competition on those calls. As I said, I think that is actually really, really useful because I think it gives context to things. Whilst, you know, what we're looking for is not really what do you think of this firm? Are they any good? Are they in this band? Because I think, as you say, that's not something we would want to sort of treat as hugely influential. But I think what's more interesting in discussing competitors is actually sort of how you're different from each other, why that makes you good at a certain sort of area of practice over another, and, you know, particularly getting sort of intelligence on maybe changes within firms, movements of lawyers, how that might affect things, because clearly people have opinions on that. You're all, you know, in the industry day to day, you know, you obviously have a very good oversight of what's going on and maybe the trajectory of different firms. And I think it's important to get that. And it's also worth noting that it isn't all negative all the time. Actually, it's quite positive. And actually, you know, what I do experience is that, you know, the majority of the people we speak to in terms of the lawyers we interview are very fair. They're very objective, actually, a lot of the time. And where credit is due to a firm that's maybe improved its practice, people are willing to give that. And I wouldn't want to miss out on that by sort of maybe reducing the amount of time we spend on that as well. But I'll stop talking now and let someone else have a go.
Yeah, actually, I would agree with Rick about turnover as well. I've been at the Legal 500 over 6 years now, and when I first started it was a revolving door. But we've made a number of changes internally to try to improve staff retention. And quite a few of the researchers do return to cover markets year on year. I know Cyprus in particular, I think this is the researchers' third year of doing Cyprus now. So we've really tried to improve that to get the continuity there. And again, going back to feedback on other firms during your phone call, we really want to get away from that. That call is to discuss your practice and how you stand out. And that actually can sometimes be down to the lawyer perhaps not recognising that and wanting to talk more about the market than their own practice. So it's just a case of managing the phone call as well.
Let's go through some of these questions that come in on the slidey. So how much time on average does a researcher put into analysing the submission before an interview? Sam, do you any idea? Do people have to read the submissions before they do the interview? Sometimes we have the criticism in interviews that they're not very well briefed.
Well, it goes back a little bit to the last point about the calls and the interviews and peer feedback. One of the things that we do on the calls, in addition to just getting feedback on the rankings, is to basically fill in gaps from the submission. So if a firm's been particularly vague about the work they've been doing, or they've noted loads of lateral hires but haven't said which firms they've come from or which firms they've gone to and things like that, we use the calls a lot of the time to fill in those gaps. So the researchers kind of have to look through the submission in quite a lot of detail before they go onto the call, because they have to pick out those questions they're going to ask. The only time that changes is if a firm is delaying their submission and we want to get the call done, then sometimes we'll do a call without a submission, then we'll spend a bit more time talking about individual work examples. They have to spend quite a lot of time looking at the submission fundamentally, because they've got to formulate some questions from it. So,
yeah, I agree fully with that as well. Our researchers definitely review submissions. Actually, typically at the beginning of research is when I advise them to do it, rather than necessarily just before the call. I usually get them to review all the submissions at the beginning, so then they can get actually the benefit of all the information that's in not just one firm's submission, but all of them. And again, I think that those calls can be very useful at finding out the connections between firms, in terms of if you're looking at sort of an area like M&A, it's very useful for us to know sort of, okay, there were these sort of 4 or 5 big deals in the market this year. These are the firms that have all put forward that they had a role on them. Then we can start using the interviews to find out, well, what role did each firm play? Was one in a sort of a more lead role? Was one in a less involved role for a third party, or whatever it might be? That's something that we definitely encourage. So yes, they will read them beforehand, and certainly should be getting up to speed on that.
Okay. Another one, how do you handle confidential matters in the submissions, and what happens if a confidential matter or client's published?
Well, from our side, we don't. We always make a point of just saying, try to make it as clear as possible. So write confidential at the start and the end of the confidential information, put it in red, and we won't do anything to it. The only thing the researcher will do is read it, obviously, so they can if it's a big high-profile mandate that they need to know about for the research, then obviously they will read through the case, but they won't talk about it any further than that. We won't sort of keep it on file. We won't publish it anywhere. So it's quite simple. The only we try to. There's no benefit in us in putting any confidential information out there, because we just get into trouble. So we try to keep quite a simple system. If something does slip through the net, then we just take it down as swiftly as possible. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Again.
And what is the weight of something which is confidential? So what does it really weigh compared to the other submissions that are published?
Well, it's sort of, if you're looking at from the ranking, it is perspective. It doesn't really matter whether a matter is put down as confidential or not, if you know what the details are. So if a firm's biggest M&A deal of the year is confidential, their role on it is confidential, well, they're still going to get credit for that, working on that M&A deal. Like, we still know they work on it. We just won't necessarily write it in their review or publish it on the website. So it doesn't really matter from that perspective. If you're putting it down as a confidential matter where all the details are confidential and we don't know what it is, then it's just a bit pointless. Like, we can't really do anything with that. So.
And that is transversal to the 3 directories on our board?
Yeah, I'd say a generic matter highlight has limited value to us, really, because we can't check it, we can't look at things. But if it's confidential and you do give us the client name, it will be treated with equal weight.
Yeah, again, equal. It's more the content of the matter and whether we're able to actually understand what happened. In terms of confidential sort of versus publishable, we have a section for each. And in many practice areas, confidential matters are vital, because if you're talking about white-collar crime or corporate investigations, obviously there are usually no publishable matters even after they've happened. So yeah, they're treated exactly equally to anything that's publishable. It's more about sort of what information we can glean from it, really. So it's making sure that you can give as much detail as you're possibly able to. Because certainly within Chambers, yeah, it doesn't go any further, as Sam said, so there's not really any need to hold back. It will only be seen by the researcher and the editor, and that's where it goes from.
Sorry, on that point, then is it better than, I asked a question earlier, and just anonymising the client name, or actually putting the client name in and saying confidential, at least you can check and verify which is better, just to take your point, it's too generic, you can't check it out.
I mean,
are you better to put the client name in and have it really start confidential? Obviously there's a risk of confidentiality from our point.
for me, I would always put as much information as you can in, including the client name, because I think what we're trying to get across is very much that you don't really have to worry about us publishing anything, as long as the submission is sort of formatted in the way that we've kind of asked it to be. So there is everything that's confidential is completely separated from what's publishable. Then.
Waiting, obviously, if you had two matters that were very generic and you couldn't really make out, it was just like a leading company in the retail sector versus the actual name of that.
I think that the client. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the situation. The client name, I would say, is helpful. There may be some pieces of work where you can get across the importance of what was done without the client name. You know, particularly there's certain practice areas where there might be sort of, new trends in that area where, there's a certain area of practice that most law firms haven't got into yet, and it's displaying a certain specialist expertise that we're looking for. It's possible you could put that in, without the client name being there, and it would be influential. But I think in all circumstances where the client name is there, it probably helps. Yeah.
Is that relevant as a thing that we can publish?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we prefer to see as much information as possible.
I'd like to ask, hi, I'm Joanna from Catricazes in Portugal. If we were to ask for your help in helping us to demonstrate the value of the incredible amount of hours everyone in the firm puts in contributing, what sort of data could you help us with, could you provide us with, that would assure that it's worth it? So on the other side, because everyone here, we're talking about input of information, what sort of evidence do you have on the consumer side of your products that could really, motivate everyone?
Besides the rankings.
Yeah.
No, but no, not the rankings. That the rankings are actually used in deciding for a firm against another, or in retaining a firm for that client, or building reputation, or whatever.
Well, I think David obviously already mentioned the RFPs point, and we are seeing that increase as well. I mean, particularly in the public sector. I know I've heard that, I think, sort of mandates with the Russian government and the Chinese government, you can't get on the pitch without having a Chambers ranking. And I think, given the scale of, some of these sort of these kind of beauty parade pitch things that law firms are going to have to go through now, and the numbers of law firms clients are getting that are interested in working with them, I think it's only natural that the directories are going to be used more at least as a filtering process to sort of narrow their shortlist down, if not to actually influence the decision. I mean, I know at Chambers we're making a lot of efforts to kind of engage with the GCs, with the client community a lot more. I know we're having sort of a range of forums next year that we're sort of going around the world, and we're having sort of dual events that are bringing in prominent clients from each country together with the law firms. There's going to be sort of editors' receptions at those where we can sort of deal with questions like you've had today as well. So there's stuff like that going on that is, I think, increasing the engagement from clients with our content. I think the other maybe proof of concept is the unpublished reports that we have as well. I think that shows sort of the volume of content that gets back. I know a lot of firms find them very useful in terms of showing the constructive feedback that clients have, sort of the volume of what the decisions are based on. I think it can also help, it's maybe overlooked sometimes, it can help with the marketing side as well, because I think, people are very quick to look at it at saying, well, that's a judgment of our performance. But actually, I know I've had discussions with firms where they feel like, look, we're really making great strides into this area, but it's not coming across in the feedback. We don't understand why. And actually, sometimes the answer is that actually it's a perception issue rather than a real issue. And sometimes it can help inform what messages the firm needs to put out about its brand, about its marketing as well. So I think we do have things. I think there's still a lot we can do more on that front. And I know that there's a commitment to do that, but there
you go. We've run out of time, but thank you to the panel. You've got some handouts. They were ideal deal descriptions, so take those away with you. Also, there's slides, and we can put some tips on there for how to improve rankings, and they'll all be available afterwards. So please thank the panel.